7,000 meters beneath the ocean's surface, where sunlight has never existed and pressure turns steel into crumpled foil, the deep sea drone descends through a darkness so complete it feels unnatural, its floodlights carving thin, trembling tunnels through black water filled with drifting particles that look less like plankton and more like ancient dust, falling endlessly as if the ocean itself is eroding from the inside. And aboard the research vessel Astraeus above, voices fade into uneasy silence as the drone's camera suddenly stabilizes, hovering in place, no alarm sounding, no collision detected, yet something has forced it to stop. Something massive and impossible occupying the space ahead. And as the lights slowly adjust, the shape resolves. Not rock, not wreckage, not some twisted geological formation, but the unmistakable silhouette of an airplane, a propeller-driven civilian aircraft from the mid-20th century, resting gently on the seabed as though it had followed a runway straight down from the sky, its wings level, fuselage intact, nose slightly elevated, propellers unmangled, paint faded yet visible. And for several seconds, no one speaks, because planes do not exist here, not at this depth, not in one piece, not ever. And yet, there it is, whole, silent, waiting. The ocean floor around it eerily smooth, lacking the debris field that every crash leaves behind, lacking even the scars of impact, as if the aircraft never struck the seabed at all but simply arrived and stopped. And when the drone begins a slow, cautious circle, the wrongness deepens. There is no corrosion eating at the metal, no collapse from pressure, no colonies of deep-sea organisms clinging to the fuselage, no life at all. As if the ocean itself refuses to touch it, a barren ring surrounding the plane like a boundary drawn by something unseen. And when the camera zooms toward the tail, a collective breath catches on the ship above as faded letters come into focus, still legible after decades in a place where nothing should survive. Flight 914, a designation that sends researchers scrambling through archives and frozen databases, because that number belongs to a civilian flight that vanished in 1946. A routine journey under clear skies, no storm, no distress call, no final transmission. Officially declared lost at sea, written off as another victim of the ocean's appetite. Yet here it is, not broken, not consumed, resting at a depth where even modern submarines struggle to survive. And as the drone's lights sweep across the cockpit windows, instruments become visible through the glass, aligned, orderly, untouched. And then the first truly impossible detail reveals itself, so subtle at first that it almost goes unnoticed. A small movement, rhythmic and mechanical, a sound picked up faintly by the drone's sensors. Tick, tick, tick. The cockpit clock is still running, counting seconds that should have ended 70 years ago, and the realization ripples through the control room like cold water through bone, because time should not exist here, machines should not function, and yet the needle continues its endless march forward, indifferent to depth, pressure, and history. And when the drone tilts closer, focusing on the altimeter, the dread sharpens into something heavier, something suffocating, because the needle is not frozen at zero or broken mid-swing, but locked with terrifying precision at a negative number, thousands of meters below sea level, as if the aircraft did not fall into the ocean, but descended through it into a place where altitude has meaning beneath the earth. And in that moment, with the ticking echoing softly through the comms and the silent plane looming in the darkness, an unspoken truth settles over everyone watching. This aircraft did not crash. It was not dragged down. It was not destroyed by weather or human error. It followed a path, deliberate and controlled, into a depth no plane was ever meant to reach, and the ocean, vast and ancient as it is, did not kill it. Something else claimed it first. The moment the realization settles, but the plane is not simply old, but impossibly intact, the atmosphere aboard the Astraeus shifts from astonishment to something heavier, something instinctual, because discovery turns into intrusion the second the drone advances closer, its lights brightening as if hesitant, illuminating the cockpit in sharper detail. And with every meter gained, the silence becomes louder, pressing against the hull of the research ship far above like an accusation. For the closer they get, the more the laws of the ocean seem to unravel. Metal that should have buckled under pressure remains smooth and unwarped. Glass that should have spiderwebbed into opaque fractures stays clear enough to see reflections of the drone's own lights trembling faintly. And still, there is no life, no scavengers, no bacteria clouds, no drifting organisms curious enough to investigate this impossible visitor. Only a perfect absence, a dead zone carved around the aircraft as though something invisible has drawn a boundary and commanded the ocean itself to keep its distance. And when the drone's camera focuses tightly on the cockpit instruments, the unease deepens into dread because everything is aligned, calibrated, orderly, not frozen mid-chaos as wreckage should be, but arranged as if the flight simply paused. And then the ticking grows clearer, louder now through enhanced sensors, no longer an imagined sound, but an undeniable mechanical rhythm echoing from the cockpit clock, tick after tick after tick, marking seconds that should have stopped counting decades ago. And the crew runs diagnostics desperately, searching for interference, for signal bleed, for any rational explanation that might preserve the fragile illusion of control. But the data returns clean, horrifyingly clean, confirming that the sound is real, local, originating from inside the aircraft itself. And as the drone angles downward, drifting closer to the instrument panel, the altimeter needle dominates the frame, sharp and unwavering, locked not at zero but far below it, displaying a negative altitude with unsettling precision, thousands of meters beneath sea level, a reading that makes no sense in any accepted model of aviation or oceanomy, because altitude does not extend downward in this way unless the reference point itself has shifted, unless the plane passed into a space where the rules of height and depth inverted. And someone mutters over comms that the instrument must be malfunctioning, yet no one believes it. Not when everything else works, not when the clock keeps time, not when the needles are steady rather than erratic. And the deeper horror emerges when archived flight schematics confirm the altimeter model is purely mechanical, impossible to function without atmospheric conditions it should not have encountered at this depth. And still, it reads accurately, insistently, as if the aircraft never stopped flying, only continued its descent long after the sky disappeared. And when the drone begins a slow exterior scan, mapping the surrounding seabed, the truth grows darker still, because the plane does not sit randomly on the ocean floor, but precisely centered within a circular formation, the seabed beneath unnaturally smooth, almost polished, a perfect disk of emptiness carved into the terrain. And beneath that disk, sonar begins to fail in a way that feels intentional, returning echoes that stretch downward without resolution, until refined imaging reveals a vertical shaft directly below the aircraft, a cylindrical void descending straight into the earth, its walls smooth beyond geological explanation, too uniform to be natural, too precise to be accidental, plunging deeper than the drone's systems can measure, deeper than the charts allow, deeper than anyone aboard the Astraeus is willing to say aloud. And it becomes terrifyingly clear that the plane did not drift into this location or crash above it by chance, but aligned with it, positioned deliberately as if guided, lowered, or received. And the idea forms unspoken among the crew that this aircraft may not be resting on the seabed at all, but hovering just above something that once opened and may open again. And when attention returns to the fuselage, subtle details begin to surface that sharpen fear into suspicion. Scratches on the cockpit door, deep, overlapping, frantic gouges torn into the metal from the inside. Not the outward deformation of impact, but the desperate marks of human hands clawing at a barrier. And the direction of the damage is wrong. The force angled not toward escape from the cabin, but toward escape from the cockpit itself, as if whatever terrified them was not outside the aircraft, but inside the front compartment. And as the drone drifts along the windows, the sense of time fractures further, because reflections ripple across the glass that do not match the drone's movement, shadows passing where nothing should move, subtle distortions that vanish the moment the camera attempts to focus, leaving behind only the hum of machinery and the relentless ticking of a clock that should not exist. And when a researcher cross-references the aircraft's flight duration with the position of the hands on that clock, a chilling discrepancy emerges, because the time displayed does not match the moment of disappearance in 1946, nor the present day, but sits somewhere impossibly between, as if the aircraft has been counting seconds in isolation, disconnected from the world above, trapped in a duration that never quite reached an ending. And then sonar pings ripple outward from the drone, mapping the dead zone further, and something responds. Not a biological echo, not a geological return, but a hollow reverberation that feels more like an answer than a reflection, rising faintly from the shaft below, causing instruments to spike and tremble as if the ocean itself has inhaled. And in that instant, the ticking briefly accelerates, the clock skipping forward by several seconds in a sudden, jarring lurch, before resuming its steady rhythm, a momentary surge that suggests synchronization, connection, awareness, and panic begins to replace awe aboard the Astraeus, voices overlapping as theories collapse under their own weight, because no explanation fits, no model holds, and the unspoken fear crystallizes into something undeniable. Time behaves differently here. Space bends in ways it should not, and the plane exists not as a relic of the past, but as a traveler suspended between states, neither fully lost nor fully present. And when the drone's lights sweep across the wings once more, a final, quiet horror settles in, because thin trails in the silt beneath the aircraft reveal faint impressions leading downward toward the shaft, as if at some point, long after the plane came to rest, its weight shifted, or something beneath it stirred, adjusting its position with deliberate care. And the crew realizes with sinking certainty that whatever lies below did not simply receive the aircraft once. It may still be holding it, waiting, keeping time, counting seconds alongside a clock that refuses to stop, measuring a descent that has not yet finished. The decision to observe the cabin more closely is never formally made. It simply happens, as if curiosity itself has become a force stronger than caution, guiding the drone forward, inch by inch, until its lights spill fully across the passenger windows, and the first thing that becomes unmistakably clear is that the people inside are not arranged like victims of a crash, but like participants in something unfinished. Every seat occupied by a body sitting upright with seatbelts fastened, heads tilted at slightly different angles, hands resting on armrests or folded neatly in laps, postures preserved with a stillness that feels intentional rather than accidental. And the horror does not arrive all at once, but creeps in gradually as the camera lingers, because there is no sign of panic frozen into their expressions, no mouths stretched wide in screams, no eyes locked in terror, only confusion, subtle and restrained. brows faintly drawn together, lips parted just enough to suggest questions left unanswered, as though whatever occurred inside this cabin unfolded slowly enough for comprehension to fail before fear could fully take hold. And as the drone drifts past row after row, the wrongness compounds because the bodies show no signs of decomposition consistent with 70 years underwater, skin shrunken yet intact, clothing preserved beyond reason, fabric colors muted but recognizable, hair still clinging to scalps in wisps and strands that should have long since dissolved. And yet there is no frost, no crystallization, no indication of extreme cold preservation either, placing the passengers in an impossible state between decay and suspension, as if time has brushed against them without fully committing. And when thermal sensors activate, another unease settles in because the readings fluctuate unpredictably, patches of the cabin registering slightly warmer than the surrounding water for no logical reason, not enough to indicate life, but enough to imply that something inside retains a memory of heat. And the crew aboard the Astraeus speaks in lower tones now, words chosen carefully, sentences left unfinished, because the more they observe, the more it feels like observation itself is being tolerated rather than ignored. And when the camera pauses on a woman seated near the aisle, her fingers curled loosely against the armrest, something unsettling emerges upon closer inspection. Her fingernails are broken, torn down unevenly, edges jagged and raw, and the metal beneath her hands bears faint scratches, shallow compared to those on the cockpit door, but unmistakably deliberate, suggesting movement after the moment when everything should have ended. And this realization ripples outward as other details surface, creases in seat cushions where bodies appear to have shifted repeatedly, not violently, but restlessly, impressions that suggest prolonged sitting rather than sudden death. And the suspicion grows that the passengers were not killed instantly, but remained conscious for an unknown duration, long enough for confusion to deepen into desperation, yet not long enough for escape or resolution. And when the drone's camera finally reaches the midsection of the cabin, it stops, hovering in a way that draws immediate attention to what is missing rather than what remains. Because one seat is empty, its cushions slightly depressed as if recently vacated, the seatbelt unfastened, straps hanging loosely against the armrests, and the surrounding passengers appear subtly angled toward it, heads turned by mere degrees, eyes unfocused yet oriented in its direction, a detail so slight it could be coincidence, and yet no one aboard the Astraeus believes in coincidence anymore. And as the camera zooms closer, disturbed silt becomes visible along the cabin floor, faint trails marking movement from the empty seat toward the front of the plane, not chaotic stuffs, but careful impressions, heel to toe, step by step, as if whoever left that seat was not running in panic, but moving with purpose, perhaps guided, perhaps summoned. And when the drone tracks the trail forward, passing more frozen faces, the sense of being watched intensifies inexplicably, instruments registering minor fluctuations without clear cause, as if the act of tracing this path is altering something unseen. And it becomes impossible to ignore the growing impression that the cabin is not merely a space preserved in time, but a stage paused mid-performance, awaiting completion. And as attention returns to the manifest data displayed on monitors above, the numerical certainty collides violently with what the camera shows. 32 passengers listed, 31 bodies accounted for, and yet the absence feels larger than a single person, as though the missing presence has distorted the balance of the entire cabin, pulling focus toward the front, toward the cockpit, where the scratch marks already hint at something that went terribly wrong. And when the camera tilts upward to capture the faces again, subtle asymmetries emerge that were not visible before, minute shifts in shadow that suggest slight differences in depth, as though some passengers are seated a fraction of a second behind others in time itself, their forms overlapping invisibly, and the suspicion forms quietly that not all of them experience the same sequence of events, that some may have perceived something others did not. And the longer the camera lingers, the more difficult it becomes to shake the sense that the expressions are changing. Not dramatically, not enough to trigger alarms, but just enough to see doubt. Because a brow seems less furrowed than before, a mouth slightly more closed, an eye no longer angled toward the aisle, and when technicians compare still frames captured seconds apart, the differences are dismissed as compression artifacts, lighting changes, parallax distortion, anything but movement. And yet no one voices complete confidence in those explanations, especially when the ticking from the cockpit grows subtly louder, bleeding faintly into the audio feed, as if the sound itself is traveling through the cabin, marking time not only for machines, but for the dead. And as the drone nears the cockpit door, the scratch marks dominate the frame, deep, frantic gouges layered over one another, metal peeled back in thin curls, and the patterns suggest repetition rather than a single outburst, as if someone returned to this door again and again, trying repeatedly to force it open. And the suspicion sharpens into dread when the scratches are found at multiple heights, some low, some high, implying more than one attempt, perhaps more than one person, and yet the trail of disturbed silt suggests only one passenger left their seat, creating a contradiction that no one aboard can reconcile. And when the drone's camera finally reaches the midsection of the cabin, it stops, hovering in a way that draws immediate attention to what is missing rather than what remains. Because one seat is empty, its cushions slightly depressed as if recently vacated, the seatbelt unfastened, straps hanging loosely against the armrests, and the surrounding passengers appear subtly angled toward it, heads turned by mere degrees, eyes unfocused yet oriented in its direction, a detail so slight it could be coincidence, and yet no one aboard the Astraeus believes in coincidence anymore. And as the camera zooms closer, disturbed silt becomes visible along the cabin floor, faint trails marking movement from the empty seat toward the front of the plane, not chaotic scuffs, but careful impressions, heel to toe, step by step, as if whoever left that seat was not running in panic, but moving with purpose, perhaps guided, perhaps summoned. And when the drone tracks the trail forward, passing more frozen faces, the sense of being watched intensifies inexplicably, instruments registering minor fluctuations without clear cause, as if the act of tracing this path is altering something unseen. And it becomes impossible to ignore the growing impression that the cabin is not merely a space preserved in time, but a stage paused mid-performance, awaiting completion. And as attention returns to the manifest data displayed on monitors above, the numerical certainty collides violently with what the camera shows. 32 passengers listed, 31 bodies accounted for, and yet the absence feels larger than a single person, as though the missing presence has distorted the balance of the entire cabin, pulling focus toward the front, toward the cockpit, where the scratch marks already hint at something that went terribly wrong. And when the camera tilts upward to capture the faces again, subtle asymmetries emerge that were not visible before, minute shifts in shadow that suggest slight differences in depth, as though some passengers are seated a fraction of a second behind others in time itself, their forms overlapping invisibly, and the suspicion forms quietly that not all of them experience the same sequence of events, that some may have perceived something others did not. And the longer the camera lingers, the more difficult it becomes to shake the sense that the expressions are changing, not dramatically, not enough to trigger alarms, but just enough to see doubt. because a brow seems less furrowed than before, a mouth slightly more closed, an eye no longer angled toward the aisle, and when technicians compare still frames captured seconds apart, the differences are dismissed as compression artifacts, lighting changes, parallax distortion, anything but movement, and yet no one voices complete confidence in those explanations. No one aboard the Astraea says it out loud, but the decision to pull the drone back is already too late the moment it's considered, because something has changed since the empty seat was discovered, something subtle yet pervasive. A shift in atmosphere that cannot be measured by instruments, but is felt in the pauses between words and the hesitation before every command. And as the drone hovers near the cockpit door, its lights trembling slightly, the ticking that once felt distant now resonates clearly through the audio feed, louder than it should be, louder than machinery alone could produce, each second falling into place with deliberate patience, as if counting towards something rather than merely passing time. And when the black box compartment is illuminated, the unease sharpens into fear because the casing shows no signs of water intrusion, no damage, no decay, only faint abrasion marks along its edges that mirror the scratches on the cockpit door, as if it too has been handled repeatedly. And when the signal is boosted to retrieve a higher fidelity recording, the transmission stutters, not failing, but hesitating, before resuming with a clarity that feels intentional, and the captain's voice emerges again, closer this time, less distorted, as though recorded moments ago rather than decades past, repeating familiar lines about steady altitude and clear skies before diverging subtly, words slipping out of sequence, pauses stretching unnaturally long, breaths audible between sentences, until the co-pilot speaks again, quieter than before, whispering, not in panic, but in awe that the horizon is below them. And the cabin noise that follows is not screaming, but murmured confusion, overlapping voices asking the same question in different ways. Where are we? Why is it dark? Why is the ocean moving sideways? And then something interrupts the recording. Not static, not interference, but silence so complete it feels invasive, lasting just long enough to unsettle before the captain speaks one final time, his voice stripped of authority and certainty, stating calmly that they are still descending, that the instruments insist they are flying, that the ocean has opened rather than risen, and that something beneath them appears to be responding. And as those words echo through the control room aboard the Astraeus, the drone's sensors register a disturbance below the aircraft, not a sudden movement, but a gradual change, a deep, resonant shift emanating from the vertical shaft beneath the plane, sending low-frequency vibrations through the seabed that ripple outward like a held breath finally released. And at the same moment, the cockpit door creaks audibly, the sound faint but unmistakable, metal flexing not from pressure, but from motion. And the drone's camera captures the door trembling, vibrating in time with the ticking clock, which accelerates slightly, seconds slipping past faster now, the rhythm no longer steady but eager. And when the door begins to open, inch by agonizing inch, revealing darkness beyond rather than the expected remains of the cockpit, the realization dawns that the interior of the plane does not reflect light correctly anymore. Shadows stretching deeper than the space should allow, angles bending subtly, as if perspective itself is being pulled inward, and the pilot's seat comes into view, empty, the restraints undone, the fabric creased as though someone rose from it not long ago, and the control yoke shifts on its own, just enough to be undeniable, responding not to water currents, but to something deliberate. And as the drone pulls back instinctively, its thrusters adjusting without command, alarms flicker across monitors aboard the ship, registering pressure changes that make no sense, because the ocean above the plane appears to be sinking, not physically lowering, but behaving as if depth itself is rearranging. And then the altimeter needle twitches, the same mechanical instrument that refused to fail, finally moving again, creeping upward by fractions, indicating ascent from a place that should not exist. And panic breaks through discipline as voices overlap, commands shouted and countermanded, because the sonar now shows movement far below the shaft, a massive presence stirring, not rising quickly, but shifting as though aligning, positioning itself beneath the aircraft with immense patience. And the black box transmission resumes without prompting, bypassing safeguards, playing audio that was never recorded by the crew's systems, footsteps on metal, slow and deliberate, moving away from the cockpit and down the aisle, accompanied by faint breathing that does not match any known passenger. And as the drone's camera swings back toward the cabin, the passengers' heads appear slightly differently angled than before, their frozen expressions altered just enough to suggest attention, as if something has drawn their awareness forward again. And the empty seat now shows deeper impressions in the cushion, the disturbed silt thicker, as though someone has returned briefly before moving on. And when the drone attempts to retreat fully, its signal falters, not cutting out, but stretching, frames lagging behind real time, showing images that the crew has not yet seen, including a brief, impossible shot of the aircraft lifting from the seabed, not violently, but gently, hovering above the circular dead zone as the shaft below widens, its edges peeling back like a pupil dilating in low light. And then the live feed catches up, snapping back to the present, where the plane still rests motionless, creating a contradiction that leaves no one certain which moment is real. And as the ticking reaches a rapid, almost frantic pace, the captain's final words echo again through the black box, altered now, layered with an unfamiliar resonance, repeating a single phrase not present in earlier recordings: "It's time to finish the descent." And at that moment, every instrument aboard the Astraeus spiked simultaneously, depth gauges fluctuating wildly, sonar painting impossible geometries beneath the ocean floor. And the crew realizes with cold clarity that the plane is not attempting to rise to the surface, but to complete a trajectory interrupted decades ago, one that does not end in the sky or the sea, but somewhere beneath both. And as emergency protocols are initiated and the order is finally given to sever the drone's connection, the feed lingers for one final second longer than expected, showing the cockpit door fully open now, darkness spilling outward, and a faint silhouette standing just inside the threshold, human in shape but distorted by perspective, waiting patiently as if aware being watched. And then the connection cuts, leaving only the echo of ticking in the minds of those who heard it. And far below, unseen by cameras but registered by instruments, the aircraft begins to move, not upward, not downward, but away, slipping into alignment with something ancient and vast beneath the seabed, while above, the ocean's surface remains calm, betraying nothing of what has shifted below. And in the final moments before the Astraeus withdraws from the site, one final transmission bleeds through the static, not a voice, but a simple mechanical sound, a seatbelt clicking into place, followed by silence, leaving behind the unbearable suspicion that the flight has not ended, that it never truly crashed, and that whatever opened beneath the plane once is prepared to open again, now that it knows it has been found.